Or fascination with the lamp. It's really, really interesting. And it's University of Chicago Press, right?
It's the University of Chicago Press, and also John Murray in the UK, and Penguin Penguin Random House in India. So.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Ubud Writers Festival Perth and our first session, The Nutmeg's Curse, with Amitav Ghosh. The session will start in just a few minutes. Thank you.
Pak Hilmar, there will be questions from the audience, and if we receive any questions, we will put it on the tab chat too.
Okay. Should we start now, or we wait?
Please wait a minute. We are still waiting for the sign from the operator. Thank you.
Okay. And how
Where
are you?
Pak Hilmar?
I'm in Jakarta. It's yeah, and really affecting your general health condition. That's what I would say. And yeah, we still don't understand, no? I mean, the real effects and the extent of this post-COVID thing. And what I also noticed from the community is like the effect that it has on the mental health. Yeah, especially with children not being able to go to school and all that. So, man, yeah, huge problems that we have. And yeah, we're still learning how to cope with all that. Yeah.
And the long-term effects are going to be devastating, actually, you know. I mean, a whole
definitely.
generation of school children who've lost a couple of years of socializing, of education. I just don't know how are they going to ever adjust to this.
Yeah,
you know?
True.
In India, there are studies already showing that it's just completely devastating, especially for poorer rural children. It's
Communities,
really bad.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, your book, in a way, is a call to put pay more attention to our general environmental issues, no? And
yes,
yeah. So I think it's timely, although you probably, while writing it, you didn't have COVID in mind, but I mean, it really speaks to our condition right now. No?
Yes, well, I wrote most of it in COVID, you know, so...
Ah, really? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the entire book is really written in this COVID time. So, yes, it was very much on my mind. And, you know, after all, we've all had so many losses of friends, colleagues, relatives. So, you know, it's been very much on one's mind. And I wrote most of it in New York, which was, you know, the epicenter of the epicenter. From March to August, it was terrible in New York, you know.
Yeah.
And then for that time, it wasn't so bad in Indonesia, but then later it got very bad in Indonesia.
Yeah. June and July was very, very bad. We had that second wave and a different type of variant of the virus, no?
The Delta variant.
The Delta variant, yeah. That from a very healthy condition, if you're infected, like 3-4 days after that, I mean, you're like fatal, the effects. So it's now it's already receding, the number of people affected and the death. But yeah, you never know, no?
So were you intubated in the hospital? Did you have to be on a ventilator?
No, but only like oxygen. So it's not like a full ventilator. So in terms of that, I was quite all right actually. But like temperature, the body temperature was like 39 Celsius.
Oh my God.
And 40. So it's really, it was really bad. But no coughing, no problems with the lungs themselves.
Do you know how you got it? Of course, as a politician, you must have to meet so many people all the time.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's from the meetings in the offices. I still at that time had to meet with several people, but we identified as a group from Aceh. Yeah, a group from Aceh, quite large. And at that time, a level of knowledge was so varied. So they came with shaking hands and all that. And,
oh my gosh, shaking hands.
But that was, that was probably it. No, so I cleaned it like right after that. But I cleaned my hand. But yeah.
Were they wearing masks?
Yeah, they were wearing masks, but yeah, probably not that effective. I guess.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear that. That's very difficult for you.
Yeah, I lost some of my personal friends as well during the pandemic.
Sure.
I mean, in June and July, that was very bad. It's like every day when you hear friends or relatives or people you know, and that was really devastating. I mean, in terms of the impact that it has on us, no, like not able to go anywhere. You keep hearing all these sad news, so that was really.
You can't go and meet anyone. That's the problem. I mean, you can't go back. You can't do anything.
Yeah.
It's just so terrible.
Yeah.
It's a really terrible disease, I mean, and from everyone who's had it, one hears stories of long COVID, which are so frightening, especially from the Delta variant,
Yeah.
Well, what are they doing now?
I don't know. Still waiting.
We are still waiting because we are still coordinating with the team in Ubud and also in Perth, because it will be streamed into 2 locations. Okay, we play the intro now, so we will start in soon. I will let you know you can.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed the pre-show. We are now about to commence the formal session. If you have any questions, please send them to the mailbox address on the piece of paper that you've been given on your chair. We will feed those questions through. Thank you.
Writers and Readers Festival 2021. This year, the festival returns with the theme Mulat Sarira, self-reflection, which is drawn from a Balinese Hindu philosophy. And from the 18th to 17th of October, we will explore the meaning of self-reflection, cultural introspection, and human rights, examining who we are, what unites and divides us, and what drives our actions. And this morning, Jakarta time, we have a special guest with us, Amitav Ghosh, who has written a book, a very excellent book. I'm still reading it, but I found it very interesting, entitled The Nutmeg Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis. And we are really happy to have Amitav Ghosh with us this morning. And we'll talk a little bit about his book. And of course, you are welcome to join later on to participate in the conversation. But I think we are still waiting for Amitav Ghosh to join us on the screen. I'm sorry, apologies. I mean, I've just been informed by the organizer that we are waiting Amitav Ghosh to connect. But yeah, I'm still reading the book and I found it very interesting. It's here, we have him back.
Sorry, my internet crashed for some reason. It never happens, but it did.
Okay. I just started, I mean, just shortly briefly introduced you and your book. So this morning we are already online. We can start, I mean, whenever you're ready. Probably
I'm
the
ready.
First question. You remember me? Yeah? Okay. Can
listen,
you hear
I'm
me?
just going to try. Yes, I can hear you. I'm just going to try my normal network. Crashes. I don't know why. Anyway.
But we are already live, Amitav.
Yes.
So let's probably just continue.
Yes.
with and then try to make it better later. So yeah, your book is going to be published very, very soon by the University of Chicago Press. And I remember meeting you, talking to you back in 2016 when you were doing your research. And what I get from your book is that you've really put a lot of effort in doing the research. It's an immense amount of research to write the book. So tell us a bit, I mean, what inspired you to write it and how long it actually take you to write it?
Well, I have to tell you that what really inspired me to write it was my trip to the Banda Islands, for which you are responsible. You and the Ministry of Education and Culture are really responsible. Yeah. I was so fortunate that John McGlynn put me in touch and, recommended me for this program. And your ministry made such wonderful arrangements that I was actually able to go to the Banda Islands. Because as I'm sure you know, it's been very hard to reach the Banda Islands for a long time, It's not been at all easy to get there and so on. So because of your team, it was much easier, They were there with me, they helped me get there. And actually, when I was there and immediately after I left, I thought, well, I've been there, I've seen it, it's done. And I wrote a short article about it and I thought, okay, now I'm going to write other stuff. And I did. I wrote a novel after that. But, that visit was very much in my head. And I suppose slowly I circled back to it. And it just haunted me, this story of what happened in the Banda Islands. And I really do think that it's a precursor of what's happening to the whole world.
Yeah, and there was in the opening chapters, I mean, you referring to Salomon's lamb. And basically the idea is that you describe the Dutch at the time of being so afraid because they are surrounded by treason, right? And that sparked a very important incident in the history of Banda. But, and I think you also mentioned about how that particular event like introduced you to the word of archives, Dutch archives, written in the old language, Dutch. Um, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about the research process into that, and how you could actually finally get hold on the information from the archives?
Well, I think, I started sort of revisiting all my material from the Banda Islands and so on, right at the start of the pandemic. In fact, I started around about the 10th of March. And, while I was there, while I was in Banda Nera, I got this little booklet from the Des Alvi Foundation, on the history of the Bandas. And, when I started looking at that history, I read it again, and suddenly, it was in that history that the fall of the lamp is mentioned. And I kind of became obsessed with that, I mean, why is it that the fall of a lamp leads to this kind of, this unbelievable massacre, And if you see, at the end of my book, I try to suggest an explanation, which is that these Dutch people, they came from a country that was then absolutely in the grip of the witch craze, the European witch craze of the 17th century. And actually, the main players, Jan Pietersen Poen, and the people around him were all from these places where the whole country was absolutely in the grip of this crazed sort of fascination with witches. They were burning witches, they were killing witches. They were doing these mass killings actually in Europe. And I think that has a very close connection to what happened in the Banda Islands. It's a strange thing that in the European literature, they like always to paint Europe as rational, scientific, etc. But in fact, if you look at this particular, ghastly massacre, I think it's absolutely clear that it was the Europeans who were completely in the grip of some kind of supernatural craze.
Yeah, which makes it really interesting. I mean, the how you put it, I mean, that the indigenous people are always seen as superstitious and all that, but basically, in this case, I mean, you really show like how colonialism is done, combines modern thinking with all these like superstitious beliefs, and which is, I mean, really interesting, because it would then also describe or paint the colonial rule in a completely different way, But you mentioned a little bit about Des Alvi. Can you tell us his role in all this, the emergence of Banda? I mean, in the 1950s, no one remembered what Banda is, but now it has become one of the major tourist destinations in Maluku. And I think the role of Des Alvi, but what is your impression on him? You never met him, right?
No, he died a few years before I arrived there, but it was his daughter really who showed me around. And, she's very involved in the running of the hotel that Des Alvi created. It's a completely lovely, charming place. Des Alvi was really instrumental in preserving this history, in creating the monuments to the Banda genocide, and really in sort of creating, in bringing Banda back, to the world's attention. The Banda Islands in the 16th and 17th century were the center of the world. I mean, that's the reason why all these Spanish and Portuguese and English and Dutch navigators wanted to go there. It was the first place they wanted to go. Magellan went straight to Maluku, and in fact, I mean, he was heading towards Maluku when he was killed. And actually, his memorial is now on the island of Tidore, And I really think you should make, that a tourist destination, because it's a very interesting aspect of world history, how, and so many major European writers of that period wrote about this, wrote about Maluku. Cervantes wrote about it. Louis de Camões wrote about it in the Lusiads. Any number of English writers also wrote about it. So it recurs again and again in world literature in that period. And I think it's very important that, this aspect of Maluku be brought back to global attention, because Maluku, even though it's so far away, it's such a remote place, even within Indonesia, was really the center of world history. And one of the aspects of that is, when you go to Maluku, all the European forts, the forts that are in Ternate, in Tidore, they're just encrusted with forts. Even in Europe, you won't see any place that has so many forts. So this was the center of global geopolitical strategy. They were fighting over it for centuries, really, until finally the Dutch won and sealed it off. So all this aspect of the history of Maluku is so important because it's completely faded in the global imagination, And it's faded for a good reason, which is, partly a lot of the history of Indonesia goes unnoticed because Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch. And people don't generally read Dutch, so Dutch history gets kind of, as it were, obscured, But what happened in Indonesia, I really feel, is very much a precursor of what is going on in the world.
But yeah, you mentioned about the Maluku being the geopolitical center, and spices were very important. But what is the use of spices? For food, medicine, but is there any? Why were the Dutch so eager to get spices from Maluku?
You can't look at it in terms of utility. For a long time, people felt that, spices were good preservatives or something, but that's not the case. Actually, salt is a much better preservative than any spice. So, what it really was is that spices were like the first commodities. They were valued because people valued them. It's completely circular, because rich people had spices at home. So that's why they valued them. Just as in a later generation in Holland, there was a craze for tulips. Now tulips don't serve any purpose. Tulips, after all, are just desired because they signify luxury or wealth or something. So spices are the precursors to that. They were valued simply because they were valued. They were the form of the commodity, just like people value Cadillacs or something. You have to remember, or Porsches or some expensive car or whatever. Simply because a handful of nutmegs. It's amazing to think of now, but 4 centuries ago, it could have brought you up. It could have bought you a house in Amsterdam. So that was entirely one. So actually, the whole race for discovering the globe and so on was, in a sense, ignited by spices.
Right. What I also found interesting is that you use a lot of archival materials in your research, but you also tend to look at local sources like poems and also other oral stories. So what is your take on that? Is it just to balance the view, or is that something really important from these sources? For example, the relationship between people and the volcanoes and all that emerge in the stories. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's you who should talk about it, Hilmar. After all, you know a lot more about it than I do. I love Indonesia. I love traveling in Indonesia. I think Indonesia is honestly just about the most interesting place on earth You know, I mean, just in its vastness and diversity. And I've traveled a fair amount in Indonesia, but I feel like I've seen nothing. You know, most of all, I just wish I could speak Bahasa, you know, which unfortunately I cannot. I can't speak or read it. So I had to try and approach it through other means, you know, through what has been already published on Indonesia. And in fact, a fair amount has been published, though on Maluku, I think a very little actually has been published. You know, there could be a lot more. But it was very interesting for me to try and understand, you know, how local people, how the people there think about the world, how they think about their own lives, how they think about their relationships with their world, with their volcanoes. But most of all, I find myself completely fascinated by the Indonesian relationship with volcanoes, you know. I mean, you know this. I mean, just flying over Java, you know, when you see those volcanoes and how alive they are, how much they speak of the Earth's vitality, you know. And certainly, I mean, I believe Mount Merapi is erupting right now, or erupted a few days ago or something.
Yeah. It's still very active. It has been very active in the last 2 years. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I think this is a very interesting and important aspect of Indonesian culture, you know, which should be better known to the world. I think Indonesians have lived with volcanoes for millennia. They know more about volcanoes than people anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, that's what is interesting. Is there any other place in the world, I mean, where you see this close relationship? Hawaii is one for sure, but I mean, in your experience, you've been traveling around, so, where volcanoes, they play such an important role in people's lives.
Yes, I think Peru must be one. I've not been to Peru, and I know nothing about Peru, but I gather Peru is a place like that. But most of all, I think it's Iceland. You know, Iceland is a place where people live in very close contact with volcanic activity, where there's a very visceral relationship with volcanoes and the landscape. And I think that's a real commonality between Indonesia and Iceland.
Yeah, I gathered that from your book. I mean, you were talking that I couldn't basically, Jan Pieter Sungkoon, basically started kind of a new approach to plantation. So by wiping out the entire population, then imposing a completely different management system and all that. I mean, in the earlier part of your book, I mean, I quote, "The tale of the Banda Islands might be read as a template for the present, if only we knew how to tell the story." And a lot of plantation is one, and then you talked about massacre. I mean, the etymology of the word itself, etc. I mean, what do you mean actually by template for the present?
Well, I think of it this way. You know, for millennia, people knew about the Banda Islands, and they knew about the nutmeg, and they knew about mace. These articles were traded very widely in China, in India, in the Middle East, in Africa, and indeed in Europe. So, you know, traders from all over the world came to the Banda Islands. They lived on the Banda Islands. Some of them lived there for a large part of their life. You know, this was the case actually throughout, you know, the port cities of the Indian Ocean. People, you know, traders from various places would go and live there. But none of these traders, I mean, they must have known how to grow nutmeg trees. You know, they could have taken the nutmeg seeds and taken them back home and grown them. I mean, there are nutmegs growing in India now. There are nutmegs growing in Africa now. So it's not that they could not do it, but none of them ever actually did that. You know, I think that's a very striking thing, that for millennia, people made this very difficult journey to the Banda Islands, you know, rather than steal the trees. And why did they do that? It's because historically, people respected, if you like, a relationship between people and the land. So a nutmeg wasn't really a nutmeg unless it was from the Banda Islands. you know. So in a sense, people recognize that there's a relationship between the land, the tree, and the people, you know. So you even think about the Dutch. The Dutch would not have said to themselves, okay, there's a place called Burgundy where they grow very nice grapes and they make a nice wine. Let's just go to Burgundy and kill all the people and take all the grapes. You know, that just wouldn't have happened, because the Dutch themselves would have recognized that there's a relationship, you know, between the people, the land, and the product. The reason they could, the reason that this very idea occurred to them in relation to the Banda Islands is clearly because of colonialism, you know, and the peculiar circumstances of colonialism, and the fact that, you know, the incredible violence that was then unfolding in North America, you know, where literally entire populations were being exterminated, you know. So clearly, I mean, you know, one end of the Dutch Empire is in Connecticut. The other end of the Dutch Empire is in the Banda Islands.
Banda.
And essentially, it was a completely globalized process. They implemented what they learned in Connecticut and in New England, in the Banda Islands. And see, what happens there is that this thing, a miracle, I mean, after all, as I said, you know, nutmegs are not necessarily useful. You know, there's nothing particularly useful about a nutmeg. It's just a beautiful thing, you know. But at that point, when they completely sever, absolutely cut off the relationship between the people, the product, and the land, is when you have the birth of this idea that the whole earth exists just to be exploited, you know. And I think that's a new moment in world history. And it's in that sense, you know, I mean, what happened to the Bandanese essentially is the resource curse. You know, that's something we see now in so many places. You know, Iraq is suffering from the resource curse. You know, so many parts of the world have just been damned by what they produce. And in effect, now the resource curse has spread to the entire planet.
Yeah. Amitav, we got a request in the chat box here. It's from Jeffrey Malafont, who has just received your pre-ordered copy of the book, and he is asking you to read parts of the book.
Oh my God! I have it here.
You don't have it there?
I do have it.
It's about the description. Yeah, sure.
Yes. Give me a moment.
Yeah, but probably you can talk a little bit. I mean, you described the nutmeg as a tiny planet. Yeah. So, what do you mean by that? Like, it's a tiny planet. I mean, it's a fruit. Probably you can describe a little bit what the nutmeg and how is it? Yeah, please go on.
You know, if you cut through the nutmeg fruit, in many ways it looks like the Earth and its atmosphere. You know, the nutmeg is a tiny Earth. It has its sort of exoplanet. It has its outer atmosphere. I mean, it's just a metaphor, of course.
Yeah.
You know, but it's a really interesting thing to see. I mean, you know, when you use a nutmeg in your kitchen, you just don't realize, you know, everything that surrounds a nutmeg, the sort of richness of possibility that's within a nutmeg.
Yeah. So the subtitle of your book, I'm looking at the cover right now. It's Parables for a Planet in Crisis. You know? And I'm checking the University of Chicago Press website, and it's here also categorized in geography as environmental geography. I mean, it has a lot of to do with geography. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the planet in crisis and what lessons can we learn, I mean, from your story about Banda.
Well, I don't think anybody can any longer doubt that our planet is in a profound crisis. You know, if nothing else, this pandemic has really made that point so very clear to us. And the pandemic is not separate from the other aspects of the planetary crisis, you know, because the pandemic has come about. Why? It's because of increasing sort of, you know, our encroachment upon other habitats, upon other, you know, life forms. So, you know, I think we see today as clearly as ever that the planet is in a profound crisis. And, you know, this pandemic, in a way, has brought it very clearly home to people. But for many of us who've been following this crisis for a long time, you know, we can see that it has so many aspects, you know. And all of these are ultimately traceable to the incredible acceleration in production and consumption that started around about 1990. You know, since the Washington Consensus, I mean, all of it is traceable to that. And, you know, you see this in Indonesia, the way that you're losing your forests in Sumatra. You know, it's just completely shocking. Why? For this palm oil, why do we need more body lotion? Who needs this? You know, is it really worth jeopardizing the future of our planet, of, you know, doing away with species like the orangutan and so on, for what? You know, I mean, that's the really astonishing thing. What is it all for?
Yeah. And in your book, there's also like a call for war against climate change. And you actually said that climate change should be tackled as sort of war. And I think I'm with you in that sense of like we need to tackle all these environmental problems. And but what I get from your book is that you also tend to think that we might find ideas, alternatives for the future from indigenous sources. Yeah. And that's why my previous question about the relationship that people have with the volcanoes, but not all the volcanoes, of course, but the land, sea, and all that. No, like people think differently then, you know, as being part of nature and all that. Do you think it really? I mean, thinking about alternatives in the future, do you think bringing in indigenous knowledge is an important thing to do? Because many other people would say it's outdated, irrelevant, but how can it be relevant today?
I don't think anyone is saying that anymore. There was a time, I mean, for the last, let's say, 100 years, or actually maybe the last 400 years, I mean, basically the modern world waged a war against indigenous people, saying they knew nothing, they were savages, they were stupid, etc., etc. Now it turns out they knew much more than we did. I mean, than you know, than various kinds of modern people did. You know, they understood very well the relationships between different kinds of environmental factors. And yes, I do think it's very important that we start paying attention. See, I'm not the only person who's saying that. In ecological studies now, there is a whole field called traditional ecological knowledge. You know, it's called TEK. They're trying to commodify it. They're trying to sort of find ways, because now in America and Australia, for example, they've discovered that indigenous people's use of fire was absolutely critical to maintaining these landscapes, you know, in a healthy state. And for years and years, you know, Western forestry practices were focused on fighting fires, suppressing fires, and now they're paying the price in these terrible wildfires that are breaking out everywhere. You know, so they're trying to bring back indigenous ecological knowledge. I think Unfortunately, the way that they're approaching it is trying to commodify it, you know, the same way that they've commodified everything else, you know. And, you know, so what I'm trying to say in my book is that you actually cannot have a traditional ecological knowledge without the traditional stories. You know, the stories are absolutely fundamental. I mean, after all, this kind of ecological knowledge is not transmitted through universities or whatever. I mean, indigenous people didn't have, you know, that kind of knowledge transmission. They transmitted their knowledge through stories, you know, and that is what is so important, that the storytellers of today have to start telling those kinds of stories again. You can't have a traditional ecological knowledge without the stories.
Yeah, that's really true. So for the audience, I mean, you're free to ask questions that the organizers will help us by writing the questions into the chat box. I mean, if you have any, please do so. We still have time to discuss. Talking about your future projects, Amitav, what are you doing right now? I mean, this, yeah. But you're back. Okay. Amitav, can you tell us a little bit about your future projects? I mean, what are you working on right now? Just to share. Yeah.
Well, you know, I just had this book come out. I have another story coming out very soon. This year has just been so busy for me because I had a book coming out earlier this year, which was a complete departure from me. I made it with, you know, an artist called Salman Toor and a musician called Ali Sethi. So we made a book called Jungle Nama, which is about, really about indigenous ecological knowledge. So that was a very exciting project. And now I have this book coming out. Next year, again, I have a couple of books coming out. So I am very, very busy.
Busy, yeah, I can tell that. Yeah. So, but any plans to translate that book into Indonesian?
No, not yet. None that some of my books are translated into Indonesian.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, this book hasn't even come out yet, so
yeah. Too early, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes, but I would love to see a translation in Bahasa.
Yeah,
that would be very exciting.
So we're still waiting for questions, if there are any, for those who are watching from Ubud or Perth. Please let us know if you got questions. Yeah, you mentioned before about the indigenous Americans, I mean indigenous Indian Americans, and and the similarity that it has. I mean, you mentioned before the one hand of the Dutch rule is in Cincinnati and the other one is in Banda. And what we seldom think about is the connection between the two. I mean, Indonesian history is very much preoccupied with what's happening here. We only study about Indonesia, probably a little bit about the VOC in Sri Lanka, but never about North America. But and you, I think, beautifully rendered the connection between the two. I mean, how Jan Pieterszoon Koen inspired that. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, how the Dutch colonial organization basically gets its knowledge and develop into a very powerful organization. Yeah.
Yes, of course. I mean, the VOC was in its time the most powerful organization in the world. It was really, and it was a pioneering organization in so many ways. It was the first multinational, if you like. It was a pioneer of capitalism. It was a pioneer in so many things. But what is so interesting about it is that for them, the Banda Islands and Maluku in general were much more important than New England, in the Americas. So they were willing to give away New England in order to hold on to Maluku, which in fact they did. I mean, and in the Banda Islands, everyone knows this, in fact, they celebrate what they call the exchange of the island of Run for Pulau Run, I mean, it was exchanged for Manhattan. They say by the Treaty of Breda, it's not quite that simple, really. But in fact, that is sort of what happened. I mean, the Dutch ceded their territories in New England in order to hold on to Banda and Maluku in general, to Ambon, Banda, etc. It's a very curious thing. I mean, in that period, really, what they earned from Maluku is just absolutely staggering. I mean, staggering sums of money. So essentially, by committing that the terrible genocide in the Bandas, I mean, that earned the Dutch an enormous amount of money.
Yeah. Well, we have questions from the audience. Our participant in Bali. Do we have Dimas? Do we have the participant from Bali?
Hello, can you hear me?
Not quite. I can sort of hear you.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes.
Hi.
Yes, hello.
Yeah.
We're coming to you from Ubud, and we're very happy to see you here. My question relates to Myanmar, a place that you have written about in the Glass Palace 20 years ago. My husband and I and our family have just come from living in Myanmar for the past 4 years, and we're forced to leave because of the coup, the military coup. I want to relate the question of exploitation that you're discussing in Indonesia, but what does it mean for the future of the species, of the planet, of humanity, when the local and indigenous people are taking advantage of the resources and the people of a place? And how can we address this challenge? It's not always colonialism. It can be indigenous now as well. What do you have to say about this?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what we see today in India, Indonesia, Myanmar, everywhere across Asia, is that local elites, political elites, commercial elites, industrial elites have completely adopted colonial practices and are really implementing these colonial practices across their countries. But I think we can't forget that these colonial practices were really enjoined by the Washington Consensus starting in 1990. I think neoliberalism is essentially nothing other than extractivist colonialism, you know, and that has been the dominant ideology that's been pushed upon the world. But again, if you take Myanmar, you know, Myanmar is a really good example of a resource curse. Myanmar, you know, from the 19th century onwards was one of the richest places on earth. I mean, Yangon was one of the biggest ports, you know, I think it was exporting more than any other port in the British Empire. Myanmar had oil, it had timber, it had gemstones, it had rice. It was incredibly rich, you know. And within a few generations under colonialism, it was just completely sucked dry. More than that, you know, I think the real tragedy that befell Myanmar, and not just Myanmar, but many parts of Southeast Asia and Asia, is the Second World War. You know, during the Second World War, Myanmar, when the British were retreating, you know, they adopted a scorched earth policy. Then when they were advancing, then the Japanese took a scorched earth policy. And, you know, you lived through the same thing. Ambon went through the same sort of hell. In Europe, America implemented a Marshall Plan. There was no Marshall Plan for Asia, you know, and the reasons behind that are purely racial. What else can you say? Racial, geopolitical, whatever you may call them. So yes, I mean, now we are paying, if you like, the bitter price of this pattern of history.
Right. We got another question here in the chat box from Sharon Flindell. And the question is, what is the best way to respectfully access indigenous wisdom and stories?
Well, I think in many ways, you know, especially New Zealand and Australia have shown us the way. I mean, you know, in Australia, indigenous stories have led to the restoration of land to many indigenous peoples. You know, the same has been true in New Zealand. I mean, in New Zealand, the courts have actually recognized the personhood of a river. And I think these are the few sort of worthwhile signs, few hopeful signs that we can see. Even in India, you know, the claims of indigenous peoples have occasionally been recognized by the high courts, by the House, even by the Supreme Court. So, you know, if you consider that those New Zealand and Australian judges who recognized, let's say, the sacredness of a river, you know, in their personal lives, they would have thought such an idea absurd. You know, I mean, that a river could be their ancestor because, you know, they are sort of like the rationalist Westerners. And yet they were willing to give this idea legal standing. And I think that's a very hopeful sign.
Yeah. Another question here. Your first trip to Banda was on a traditional Indonesian Pinisi sailing ship. Is that true?
No, it was not my first trip to Banda. It was my trip to the Flores.
Okay. Yeah, but the question here is that, Jeffrey Malafont, he wants you to tell us a little bit about that experience, sailing in a traditional boat.
Oh, it was completely wonderful. And for that, I have to thank Janet Denise of the Bali Festival. I forget exactly the year, but I had come to the festival, my wife and I. And afterwards, we went in the Finisi schooner, in this wonderful Bugis schooner. We went, you know, to so many wonderful places. And, you know, I must say, I think really the Flores Sea is today perhaps the most biodiverse, the most interesting in terms of diving. I mean, in terms of snorkeling. I mean, what we saw there, I can never forget. I mean, I remember one day when we were swimming with these giant manta rays, and the manta rays, you know, were playing with us. They were looking us in the eye. They were sort of making eye contact, they were playing. I mean, they were such alive beings, you know, in the water. I remember another day when I was just looking down through this, you know, I was snorkeling, looking down through this funnel of sunlight, and right at the bottom was this amazing creature that was like an angel. In fact, it was a turtle. You know, it was, I think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. So I really think the Flores, simply because, you know, the seas around there have waters that are upwelling from abyssal deeps, are still not as overheated as waters elsewhere. I mean, you know, I've also gone snorkeling in places, you know, off the coast of Myanmar, for example, which I thought would be fairly untouched, but it's not. It's absolutely devastated. You know, in that Andaman Sea region. The same can be said of the Caribbean. You know, those coral reefs are really, really devastated. In fact, I think the Flores Sea preserves, and actually the seas around Banda. Again, you have the same phenomenon of water upwelling from the abyssal deep. You know, so those are still some of the last redoubts on Earth. You know.
We have another question from Bali. The last question, I think, because we are running out of time. So please, the organizers, if you can.
Hi. Sorry, your video is behind me, but I'm looking at the camera.
I can't see you, though. They're not showing us your video.
Yeah.
Okay.
They should. Please show us the video.
Okay. Oh, there we go. I was really interested by when you mentioned the importance of indigenous story. I would like to ask you about the commoditization of culture and how that can either, how that can help the sharing of indigenous story or change it potentially. If you could speak about that, thank you.
I don't know that I can say so much about it, honestly. I think this is something that many indigenous thinkers have been thinking about for a long time. Certainly that's the case in North America, and I'm sure it's the case also in Australia and New Zealand. It's certainly something to be aware of, but I think we also have to be grateful that these stories are at all available to us.
Well, thank you so much, Amitav, for being with us, and thank you also for your patience. And it's a little bit about Flores. You've been to Labuan Bajo?
Yes, I think it's one of the most beautiful cities in the world.
Yeah. Well, if time allows, next year we will invite you again. I mean, to come to Indonesia. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, then. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you also for supporting the Yayasan Mudra Sbari Saraswati Patrons Program, and to the Festival partners who made the Ubud Writers Readers Festival possible. So I turn the microphone now to the organizers. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience. We did have a few technical issues in Bali, but still a very, very interesting session. We will start our next session in a few minutes, Self-Reflection and Loving Kindness with Bridget, Lowry and Michael Dunn. See you again then.
Blah, 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 blah. Thank you.